The north is cold and full of whispers.
She had built him in her mind the way a careful woman builds anything, piece by piece, from the materials available tested against what she knew of the world, discarded and rebuilt when the materials proved unreliable. The materials in this case were limited. She had met Eddard Stark exactly once before their wedding. The ceremony had lasted 1 hour and 20 minutes by her private count, long enough to seal 2 houses and bury 1 brother and change everything. Not long enough to know a man. He had brown hair. Gray eyes, like all of them, like everyone from the north seemed to have. He had held her hands during the vows, and his grip was careful rather than strong, which she had noted and filed away. He spoke quietly. He did not cry. She did not cry either, but her reasons were different. She was watching. That was 7 months ago. She stood now on the steps of Riverrune's main gatehouse, her back aching from the weight she carried, one hand pressed flat against the curve of her belly where Robb was sleeping or turning or doing whatever it was that unborn children did in the dark. The red fork moved below the walls, sluggish and brown, carrying the smell of river mud and old rain. The September sun was low and cutting. Her maids stood behind her in a line. She had told them twice to go inside. They had not gone inside. She had stopped telling them. The raven had said midday. It was 3 bells past midday. When the party finally appeared at the far end of the causeway, she counted them before she could stop herself. 11 men. 4 horses with riders. 1 wagon. 2 riderless horses carrying supply. Small, Eddard Stark had ridden to war with 40 men and come back with 11, and that was the first piece of information she filed away about the character of this war. She did not move from the steps. He came through the gate, and she watched him cross the yard, and she understood 2 things immediately. The man walking toward her was not the same person who had spoken those quiet vows 7 months ago, and something was wrong. Not wrong the way exhaustion was wrong the way grief was wrong, the kind of wrong that had weight and permanence to it. His face was hollowed at the cheeks. His eyes had the particular quality she had seen in soldiers who came back from battles missing parts of themselves they were not talking about. He held himself straight because it cost him something not to, which meant it was a decision rather than a natural posture. And in his arms, wrapped in stark gray wool, there was a baby. Catelyn Tully looked at the baby, then looked at her husband. "My lady," Ned said. "My lord," she said. Behind her, she heard her maids begin to whisper. She turned and looked at them with a single expression that stopped the whispering. They went inside. When she turned back, Ned was watching her with something in his face she did not yet have a name for. Not shame, closer to dread. "I need to speak with you," he said. Privately they sat in her father's solar, which was empty because her father was on the Trident confirming losses and would not return until week's end. The fire was low. She had not summoned a servant to build it up because she did not want anyone else in this room. The baby slept on the table between them, still wrapped in gray wool, making the small sounds that sleeping things made. Catelyn folded her hands on the swell of her belly and looked at her husband. "Her name," she said. "Tell me her name." Ned was quiet for a moment. Then, it wasn't Ashara Dane. She had already known that. She had known it the moment she saw his face in the yard, known it with the same certainty she knew weather patterns over the Red Fork. From signs, rather than proof. Ashara Dane would have produced shame. What she was looking at produced something heavier. "Then whose?" she said. He told her. Not all at once. He told her the way a man pulls a blade from his own body, one careful piece at a time, stopping between each piece to see if she was still breathing. Rhaegar Targaryen. Lyanna Stark. A ceremony in secret. Some septon he did not name in a place he did not describe. Willing, he said that word carefully, and she heard what he was doing with it, and she let him have it for now, because she needed the rest of the information before she could decide what to do with any of it. A tower in Dorne. Blood, his sister dying when he arrived. A promise extracted from a dying woman. And now the promise was sleeping on her father's table in gray wool. When he stopped speaking, the room was very quiet. Catelyn looked at the baby. Dark hair. A tuft of it, soft and dark against the gray cloth. A face too young to tell much, except that it was a Stark face, angular, northern, nothing warm or golden in it. Gray eyes, barely open, regarding the ceiling with the blankness of something that did not yet understand what ceilings were. She felt something move in her chest, and she named it precisely, because she was a woman who named things precisely. Fury, cold and structured, not the hot kind that said things it regretted, the cold kind that did calculations even while it burned. She had been entitled to know this, before the vows, before the ceremony, before she bound herself to a man and a house and a secret she had not consented to carry. She had a right to this information, and it had been withheld from her, and she would not pretend that was nothing. But her hand pressed flat against her belly again. Robb was turning. She could feel the slow press of a knee against her ribs, that intimate imposition she had grown accustomed to, and sometimes thought she might miss when it was gone. Her child. Her blood. The heir of two houses and the product of the exact political calculation that had placed this man and this secret in her life. If Robert Baratheon ever learned what was sleeping on this table, the thought completed itself before she could stop it, and it was not comfortable. Robert Baratheon was not a stupid man, whatever else he was. He was a man who had started a war over a woman, which meant he was capable of enormous and catastrophic feeling, and men capable of enormous and catastrophic feeling did not respond to the discovery of a living Targaryen heir with measured legal reasoning. They responded the way Robert responded to most problems, loudly and with a hammer. If Robert learned what this child was, if Varys's little birds in the north traced this baby's blood to its actual source, they would not stop at the baby. They would not stop at Ned Stark. They would not stop. Catelyn was 18 years old and 8 months pregnant, and she understood, with perfect and terrible clarity, that the secret sleeping on this table was the most dangerous thing in the Seven Kingdoms. It was in her house now. There was no version of this in which she could make it stop existing. There was only what came next. She looked at her husband. He was watching her, still with that expression she had not named. She named it now. He was waiting to be rejected. He had expected fury and refusal, and perhaps a formal letter to her father dissolving the match on grounds of concealment. He had brought this child to her because there was nowhere else it could safely go, and he understood that the cost might be everything. "The woman," Catelyn said. "Ashara Dane. Is she someone who will contradict the story?" Ned blinked. She watched him recalibrate. "She is dead," he said. She died. After I returned her brother's sword. Then the story holds." She was thinking quickly now, which was where she worked best. In motion, forward, not backward. "You will tell no one else. Not your bannerman. Not Maester Luwin. Not Benjen. The story is Ashara Dane, and she is dead, and the dead do not speak." She paused. "He will live with us, not as a bastard. A bastard's life is small and cornered, and a boy with this blood cannot afford to be cornered." Another pause. "But not yet as what he is. When the time comes, I will tell you." Ned stared at her. She could see him trying to understand what he was looking at. He had prepared for a particular conversation. She had given him an entirely different one. "Catelyn," he said, quietly, "what are you? I am protecting my family." She said, "That is all this is. Everything I am about to do not mistake it for anything else." He was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. One slow motion, the nod of a man who understood he had just handed a weight to someone better suited to carry it. She went to the garden alone after dark, when Ned was with his men and the maids were settled, and the keep had sunk into its nighttime quiet. Riverrun had no godswood. No weirwood with its bleeding carved face and ancient memory, but there was a garden at the east end of the keep, old enough that the trees there had grown into shapes no gardener had ever intended. She had played here as a child. She had cried here when she learned about Brandon. She had stood here the morning she rode out to marry a stranger. She was carrying the baby. She hadn't decided to do it. She had simply found herself at the nursery door, and then at the garden gate, and then she was standing under the oldest of the trees with him in her arms, and the night air off the Red Fork was cold and smelled of rain coming, and she looked down. He was awake. Gray eyes, too dark for a child so young, looking up at her with the quiet attention of something that did not yet understand what it was looking at, but looked anyway. She looked at his face. Really looked. A Stark face. Lyanna Stark's face, probably. She had never known Lyanna Stark, had only heard what Ned did not say about her, which was itself a language she had learned to read. She had heard enough to know, dark hair, gray eyes, and a fierceness people could not stop describing even now that she was buried. This child had her eyes. The woman who had complicated Catelyn's marriage before it started had this child's eyes, and Catelyn was standing in a dark garden in the rain holding him, and she did not put him down. She said nothing to him. There was nothing to say to a baby in the dark. She stood there long enough that the first drops of rain began finding their way through the leaves overhead, and she pulled the gray wool closer around him, and she looked at his face one final time, and she understood something she had not understood until this moment. Everything she was about to build was contained in this face. A Stark face. A Targaryen soul. And it was, whether she had chosen it or not, her responsibility now. She turned and carried him back inside. She did not look back at the garden. She did not need to. The decision was already made. 14 years is a long time to keep a secret. It is also, Catelyn discovered in careful increments, an education. Not her education. His. She had no formal name for what she was doing. She did not allow herself to think of it in grand terms, because grand terms invited carelessness, and carelessness was the thing she feared most in all of this. Not exposure, not Robert Baratheon, not Lannister gold finding its way into the right pair of ears. Those she could plan against. Carelessness she could not. So she kept the work small and deliberate. One lesson at a time. 1 year at a time. While Winterfell moved around them both, and the north stayed cold, and the secret stayed buried. Maester Luwin kept a set of carved wooden ravens in the library. He used them to teach the Stark children their numbers, each bird a count, each count a step, each step a small competence earned. He had used the same birds for 20 years, worn smooth at the edges by generations of Stark fingers. Catelyn borrowed them one afternoon without explanation. She sat Jon across the table from her, a small boy with dark hair and serious eyes that were already, at 3, watching everything with an attention that made her slightly uneasy, and laid the ravens out in a row between them. He counted to 10 without being asked, then looked up. "Why do they fly south?" he said. He meant the ravens, the real ones, the ones she sent and received from Winterfell's Maester Tower at all hours. He had been watching them from windows. Catelyn considered the question with the attention it deserved. "Because that is where they are needed," she said. He accepted this without further question. She filed the acceptance away, a child who understood that some answers were partial and waited without complaint for the rest. That was not a thing you taught in a day. Either it was there or it was not. It was there. 3 years passed. She watched him grow the way she watched everything, from a distance that looked like indifference and was actually something more controlled than affection. Ned took the boys to the training yard on a gray October morning, Robb and Jon together, the way they went most places, the Lord's heir and the ward who was not quite anything the household had a settled name for. Catelyn watched from the gallery window. She told herself she was reviewing the castle accounts. The accounts were open on the table behind her. She did not look at them. Below, Robb was laughing. He laughed easily, Robb, a boy built from warmth and a headlong joy that expressed itself loudly and without apology. He swung a wooden sword, and when it connected with the practice dummy he made a sound of pure satisfaction and turned immediately to see if Jon had seen. Jon had seen. He was always watching. That was what she noticed. While Robb moved through the yard the way young boys moved through things, forward, loudly, waiting for the response, Jon stood still and watched the older garrison men sparring at the far end. Still, cataloging, she could not see his face from this angle, but she did not need to. She had learned to read the set of his shoulders. He was not watching a performance. He was watching a puzzle. Rhaegar Targaryen. She had heard enough about him during the years of the rebellion to know The man had read battles the way scholars read texts, identifying patterns, building toward conclusions. She looked at the boy standing in the yard and recognized the posture. She had not invented it in him. It had arrived whole. She turned back to the accounts, worked for exactly 4 minutes, then got up and went downstairs to speak to Sir Roderick about expanding Jon's training schedule. She called him to her solar one evening after the other children were in bed. Fire built against the October cold. Maids sent away. On the table between them was a map, not the north alone, all of it, the 7 kingdoms, the sea routes, the mountain passes, the rivers and roads and choke points a moving army needed to cross. "Tell me where the wealth is," she said. Jon studied the map without touching it, then pointed at King's Landing. "No," she said. He looked at her. Then, back at the map. She watched him think, not the performance of thinking, the visible working, the furrowed brow, but the genuine interior version. His eyes moved across the parchment slowly. He placed his finger on the Westerlands. "No," she said again. He went still, looked longer, then moved his finger slowly to the reach. "Yes," she said. "Tell me why." "The grain," he said. A pause. "The cattle. The orchards." He looked up. "Everything that feeds people." "Food beats gold," she said. "A starving man cannot spend coin. The wealth is in what feeds people, the routes that carry it, and the houses that control both. Everything else is numbers on paper." She tapped the red fork with one finger. "What does this river tell you?" He studied it. "Whoever controls this controls movement. Between the north and the south. Whose river is it?" A pause. He knew. She had made sure he knew in small ways over years. "Tully," he said. She nodded. She rolled the map and said nothing further, because she had a rule about these lessons. One thing, driven deep. Piling lessons produced scholars. One lesson, repeated correctly, at depth, produced something more useful. He did not ask why he was learning this. He had stopped asking around age 7. She had decided it did not matter whether that patience was trained or innate. Septim Ordain's formal objection lasted 3 days. The nominal reason Catelyn offered was efficiency. Sansa retained information better with a study partner. Mordain understood there was more to it, and disapproved in the practiced way of women who recognized their disapproval was decorative. Jon sat at the corner of the table during history lessons. He was careful with Sansa and quieter than Mordain, which was not difficult. Sansa learned the faith because it was beautiful and correct. Jon learned it because Catelyn had explained to him, once in under 2 minutes, what it actually was. The loyalty of half the realm, expressed in 7 faces. After the 4th week, Mordain told Catelyn, with the expression of a woman conceding a point against her will, that the boy had an unusual aptitude for institutional structure. He understood how things were organized, who answered to whom, where the power actually lived inside a hierarchy versus where it appeared to live. Catelyn said nothing, and dismissed her, and felt, privately, the particular satisfaction of a builder watching the first joint hold weight. Ned sat with him in the godswood, at the foot of the weirwood, in the way Ned conducted all his most difficult conversations, in front of the bleeding stone face of gods he believed were listening. Catelyn was not there. She had been very clear that this was Ned's part. She was in her solar when Ned came back. He sat across from her without speaking, and she read his face and understood the conversation had happened. "How did he take it?" she said. "He asked if he was mine," Ned said. "Those were the first words. Am I yours? And what did you tell him?" "The truth. That he is blood of my blood. My sister's blood." Ned was quiet. He didn't cry. He sat with it for a long time, looking at the weirwood. Then he asked me something I didn't expect. Catelyn waited. He asked what it meant for Robb, Ned said. Not what it meant for him. For Robb. Whether Robb still held Winterfell, whether this changed what Robb was. The fire moved. Outside, the yard was quiet. "What did you tell him? That Robb is Lord of Winterfell, that nothing changes that." Ned looked at his hands. He nodded. He didn't look relieved. He looked like someone who had just been handed something heavy and was already deciding how to carry it without letting people see the weight. Catelyn turned back to the letter she had been writing. "Good," she said. It was not a small word in her mouth. 297 ac. Jon is 14. It was late, the kind of late when Winterfell's sounds sank into a lower register, fire popping. Wind finding the gaps in the old stone, a dog in the yard going quiet after one bark. Jon sat across from her in the solar, in the particular careful posture he had developed over years, the posture of a boy who understood his body, communicated things he might not intend, and had adjusted accordingly. She had been waiting for the right moment to begin this. She had concluded there was no right moment, there was only now. "Your Grace," she said. He flinched. Small, controlled, but there. "Don't," she said, without softness, because this was not a soft lesson. You will hear it in rooms larger than this one, from men with more power than I have, in circumstances where flinching costs you something you cannot afford to lose. She let that sit. "So we begin here, where the cost is low. Your Grace." Jon looked at her across the fire, gray eyes steady, taking the weight of it the way she had spent years teaching him to take weight, without performing the bearing of it. "Do you hate me?" he said. She had been waiting for that question for years. She had prepared a careful answer. What came out instead was the honest one. "I hated what you represented," she said. "I have come to understand that what you represent is the only future in which my children live." She held his gaze and did not look away. "That is not love. Do not mistake it for love." "I know," he said. "But it is not nothing." He was quiet. The fire moved between them. "I will not waste it," he said. She turned back to her letters. He picked up the book he had brought, a history of the accord she noticed, and did not comment, and opened it to a marked page. Neither of them said anything else. Outside, the wind found the stones, the way it always did. The candle burned low. She wrote until her hand ached, and he read until his eyes went distant, and that silence between them. Built over 14 years of lessons and distances and small, deliberate truths, was, in its way, the most honest thing in Winterfell. She did not call it anything. She did not need to. It was already there, solid and specific, the way all the things she built tended to be. It was enough. She heard them before she saw them. The sound traveled ahead of the procession the way storm weather traveled, a low, building pressure against the quiet. Horses first, then voices, then the particular machinery of a court in motion, wagon wheels and armor, and the undignified clamor of 300 people who had been riding for 40 days and had stopped caring, somewhere around the neck, what they sounded like. Catelyn stood at Winterfell's main gate in a gray wool gown, with her hair braided, and her face composed, and her hands absolutely still at her sides. Beside her, Ned behind them, the children in order, Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon. Jon stood slightly to the left, slightly behind, in the position they had never formally assigned him, and never needed to. He had found it himself. He was 14 years old and already knew the geometry of a room. The gates opened. Robert Baratheon came through first, which was either protocol or habit, she could not tell, and suspected he could not either. He was larger than she had expected. She had heard descriptions from Ned, from her father, from men who had fought beside him in the rebellion, and none of them had quite conveyed the specific quality of his size, which was not the size of a warrior anymore, but the size of a man who had once been a warrior and had put something enormous in that place instead. He rode with the posture of someone who had forgotten the horse was there. His beard was the kind of beard that had stopped being a decision. Behind him came the Queen. Catelyn met Cersei Lannister's gaze across 40 feet of courtyard before Robert had finished dismounting, and she understood several things at once. The woman was watching everything. The woman had been watching since the gates opened, and the woman's courtesy was a surface so polished it had no fingerprints on it at all. She filed this away and arranged her face into its welcoming configuration. Robert embraced Ned the way men embraced who had bled beside each other and would spend the rest of their lives pretending the world was still the size it had been when they were young. He was loud about it. He said Ned's name twice and slapped his shoulder and said something about the cold that made the men around him laugh, and then his eyes moved, casually, the way powerful men's eyes moved, with a casualness that was its own kind of attention across the assembled household. He stopped on Jon. Not for long. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. But Catelyn saw it, and she felt Ned go very slightly still beside her, and she kept her own face at exactly the angle and expression it had been before. "This one looks more Stark than the rest," Robert said to Ned, with the cheerful bluntness of a man who said whatever crossed his mind, and had done so for 35 years without significant consequence. He was already moving toward the steps. "Must be something in your blood, breeds true, I suppose." Jon said nothing. He did not look away. He held Robert Baratheon's passing attention with the composure of a boy who had rehearsed this, in his own mind, 100 times, and had found the rehearsal less difficult than the reality, and was adjusting in real time without letting any of that show. Catelyn did not look at Jon. She moved to receive the Queen. Cersei Lannister's handshake was the handshake of a woman who had made an art form of the social surface. Warm enough, firm enough, nothing given. Her eyes, green and very sharp, did the actual work while her mouth said the required things about the journey and the cold and the beauty of the North, which she clearly found neither beautiful nor cold so much as simply lesser. "Lady Stark," Cersei said, "your home is charming." "Your grace honors us," Catelyn said. A small pause, barely a breath, in which both women heard the full conversation underneath the words they were saying, and made their first calibrations. Catelyn looked at a woman protecting a secret. She did not know the shape of the secret yet. She knew only that it existed, because a woman with nothing to hide did not hold herself with quite that quality of control. It was the control of someone managing the distance between what was true and what was being performed, and Catelyn recognized it the way she recognized her own reflection. Cersei looked at, she could not know exactly, but Catelyn suspected, a northern wife who was more than she appeared. The Tully blood, perhaps, the composed face on a day that should have produced nerves. Something about the way Catelyn had arranged her household that was too deliberate to be domestic instinct. They smiled at each other with genuine mutual recognition and said nothing that was true for another 4 minutes, and then the court moved inside, and the performance began in full. The great hall roared. Robert told stories. The wine from the south came out before the northern ale was half finished, which told Catelyn something about who this court had become in 15 years of peace, men who wanted the thing they'd brought rather than the thing they'd been given. She noted which Lannister men drank fastest. She noted where Jaime sat, golden and bored, conducting a private survey of the room with his eyes that he probably thought was subtle. She watched Jon from across the hall. He sat in his correct position, the peripheral one, where the bastard placed himself at feast, present enough to show respect, absent enough to avoid discomfort. He was eating very little, which she recognized as a sign that he was concentrating. His eyes moved between Robert, Cersei, and Jaime with the measured rhythm of someone running a count. Good, she had not told him to watch those 3 specifically. He had arrived at it himself. The evening pressed on. She managed 7 conversations simultaneously and remembered the details of all of them, and entered none of them fully. Because the part of her mind that ran beneath the surface of all social performance was doing its own accounting. The gate had held. Jon had held. Cersei was watching, but had found nothing to watch yet. Halfway through the second course, Robert leaned toward Ned and said something she was too far away to hear, and she saw Ned's face change. A fractional shift. The specific shift of a man receiving news he had been dreading, and she understood before either of them rose from the table. The crypts. She did not follow them in. The passage to the crypts was narrow, and the pretense of coincidence would not hold if she was found there. Instead, she placed herself in the corridor above, close enough that sound moved up through the old stone the way it always did in Winterfell's bones, where the castle's age worked against privacy. She listened. Robert wept, not elaborately. He was not a man built for elaborate weeping. But she heard it, the roughened edge of a large man's voice going briefly, unwillingly soft, and she heard what he said about Lyanna Stark. The way he said her name, the specific texture of a grief that had been carried so long it had become structural, like a weight-bearing stone. The rebellion, the war, everything he had won that felt, apparently, like loss. Catelyn stood very still in the cold corridor and listened to a man mourn the mother of the child she had been raising for 14 years. And she felt something she had not expected, the particular vertigo of a story understood from every side at once. Robert's grief was real. Lyanna's choices had been real. Rhaegar's love, whatever it had apparently been real. And the boy eating very little at the far end of the feast table above her was the real consequence of all of it. Sleeping in a castle where the woman he came from was buried 60 feet below. She heard Ned's voice in response. Careful, patient, absorbing what his king needed to put down. She thought, this is the man who will kill Jon if he finds out. This grieving, fat, loud, genuinely bereft man is the most dangerous person in the Seven Kingdoms to the boy I have spent 14 years preparing. And he is weeping over the grave of Jon's mother, while Jon sits upstairs counting the spaces between threats. She straightened, walked back toward the hall, filed the grief away with everything else, because grief was information too. Robert emerged from the crypt passage still rubbing one hand across his beard, the gesture of a man resetting himself to the version he presented in public. He moved through the hall toward more wine, and the court rearranged itself around him the way courts did, the natural gravity of a king pulling smaller bodies into new configurations. Jon was crossing the far end of the hall toward the side passage, returning from some errand she had not assigned him, timing she had not arranged. Robert stopped. He looked at Jon the way he had looked at him in the yard, that same 3 or 4 seconds, longer than a passing glance, shorter than recognition. He said something to Ned, who was at his shoulder. She was close enough now. "Your bastard has a good face," Robert said. "Thoughtful, half his attention already somewhere else. Serious eyes. Reminds me of someone." A pause. "Can't think who." He moved on. The court moved with him. Catelyn looked at Jon across the hall. Jon looked back at her. She gave him the smallest nod she had. Well done. He gave her nothing back. Which was also, precisely, well done. She found out about the wall the way she found out about most things that threatened her plans, from someone who was not Jon. Benjen Stark mentioned it at breakfast, 3 days into the royal visit, in the offhand way of a man sharing uncomplicated family news. He was telling Ned something about the Watch's recruitment, and he said Jon's name with the easy possessiveness of an uncle who had already made the arrangement in his mind. Ned had nodded, not quite confirming, not quite refusing. The way Ned nodded at things he had not yet decided, which meant he was inclined to agree. Catelyn set down her cup. She said nothing for 4 hours. She managed the household, received 2 Lannister ladies who wished to compliment her tapestries, arranged a seating adjustment for the evening's smaller supper, and conducted in the back of her mind the most important argument she had ever prepared. When Ned came to their chambers before the midday hour, she was at the window. "I know," she said before he spoke. He stopped. He was learning, finally, to stop when she said that. "Benjen mentioned it," she said. "Jon asked you last night, before the feast. He wants—" "I know what he wants," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She stayed at the window because she thought better standing, and because the yard below gave her something to look at while she organized what she was about to say. Below, Jon and Robb were crossing toward the armory together. Jon was talking. Robb was listening and laughing, which was their usual configuration, and had been since they were old enough to walk side by side. "The wall removes him from the board," she said. "Not from danger, from play." She turned. "A man of the Night's Watch takes no wife, holds no lands, swears himself to a single purpose until he dies. That is all he is, ever, from the moment he speaks the vows. That is the design." She held Ned's gaze. "We have spent 14 years preparing him for something. The wall ends that in an afternoon." Ned's expression was the particular one of a man who already knew this, had not yet found the counter-argument, and was hoping she would slow down long enough for him to find one. She did not slow down. "Robert is offering you the handship," she said. "He hasn't asked yet. He will ask tonight, or tomorrow, in the crypts or somewhere else he considers private, and when he does, you will have a decision to make about where Jon goes." She moved from the window and sat across from him, not the wall, south, with you as your squire. Ned was quiet. Then Catelyn. Listen, you want to bring him to King's Landing." He said it carefully, in the voice of a man naming something that sounded worse spoken aloud than it had in his own head. "To the city with Varys in it. With Littlefinger. With Cersei." "Yes, that is here the reasons," she said. "Then tell me I'm wrong." He closed his mouth. She counted 3 breaths. "Then, the documents that confirm his parentage are in the south. In the Citadel at Old Town, or at the Great Sept, or both. Someone needs to be positioned to find them, and that someone cannot be a stranger. It needs to be someone we control absolutely. A squire accompanying his lord father moves through the Red Keep with exactly as much access as we need, and exactly as little visibility as we require." She paused. "Varys's birds are already in the north. They have been for years. The wall does not make Jon invisible, it makes him irrelevant, which is worse. An irrelevant piece is a wasted piece. In the capital, Jon is beneath notice. He is a bastard squire. No one in that court has any reason to look at him carefully, which means we choose when he is seen and how." Ned's jaw tightened. "And when he makes a mistake? When someone looks closely enough?" "He is 14 years old and has not made a mistake yet," she said. "Not one that has cost us anything." She let that sit. Ned looked at his hands. The scarred ones. The hands that had carried Jon from a tower in Dorne, and set him in Catelyn's arms, and changed the shape of everything that came after. He had the look he got when he was not arguing anymore, but had not yet admitted he agreed. "Littlefinger," he said. "Finally, do not trust him," she said. "Not with anything operational. Not with Jon's name, not with his presence. Not with anything Littlefinger offers to do for you, regardless of what he asks in return." She held Ned's gaze. "What he recommends? Do the opposite. He is not advising you. He is moving you. You speak as though you know what he wants." "I know what he has always wanted," she said. "I knew it when I was 15, and he was 12, and he looked at me the way that particular kind of boy looks at things he has decided belong to him." She stood. "He arranged Jon Arryn's death. Ned, not alone perhaps, not directly. But Jon Arryn was investigating something the Lannisters wanted buried, and Littlefinger benefits from chaos the way other men benefit from order. His hands are in this." Ned stared at her. "That is an extraordinary claim." "Watch him," she said. "Use him the way you use a mirror, to see what you are not supposed to see. Whatever he recommends, it serves Littlefinger. That is the only reliable fact about the man." She moved to the writing table and pulled out 3 sheets of parchment. "What are those?" Ned said. "Letters," she said. "That I should have sent 6 months ago." The letters went out that afternoon, carried by 3 separate riders on 3 separate routes. The first went to a Tully cousin, her father's sister's second son, a minor knight named Sir Desmond Vance, who had taken household service at the Red Keep 8 years ago at Catelyn's quiet suggestion, and had been providing the specific kind of unheroic, unambitious, watchful service she valued most. She told him Ned was coming. She told him to be available, to say nothing to anyone else, and to begin mapping which household knights answered to Janos Slynt and which answered to themselves. The second went to a merchant family in the Riverlands whose trading routes ran goods through Flea Bottom, the kind of family that knew every alley between the harbor and the Street of Silk, whose loyalties ran not to any house, but to the person who had cleared their debt 15 years ago. She told them to maintain a room near the river gate. She gave them the message format she would use if she needed to reach it quickly and without a name attached. The third letter was the hardest. Lysa, her sister, who was fragile in ways that had become structural, who was raising Robin Arryn at the Eyrie with the consuming intensity of a woman who had poured everything that remained of her into a single vessel. She had not told Lysa any of this. It had been too uncertain, and Lysa was not, she found no way to soften it, even in her own mind, reliable under pressure. She did not tell Lysa the truth. Not yet. She wrote, "If Petyr Baelish comes to the Eyrie, if he sends word, if he offers anything, money, alliance, advice, marriage, anything at all, send word to me before you answer. Through the Tully channel only. Do not reply to him until you hear from me." She sealed it, handed it to the rider, watched him go. The morning of departure arrived gray and cold, which was most mornings in Winterfell, which Catelyn had long ago stopped noticing. She was at the battlements when the yard began to fill below. The controlled chaos of a company forming up, horses led out, bags secured, Ned's household guard moving into position with the practiced quiet of men who had done this enough times that it required no instruction. Jon was already in the yard. He was always already somewhere before she expected him to be. He was standing with Robb at the edge of the yard, near the stable doors, and she could not hear them from here, but she did not need to. Robb was talking. His hands moved when he spoke, always had. Some Tully trait, her father had it too, the inability to communicate without the whole body joining in. He was saying something that made him grin, and Jon was listening with the full attention he gave to things he was trying to fix in memory. Then, Robb said whatever it was, and Jon looked at him sideways, and a smile crossed his face. Brief, unguarded, the kind that did not perform itself, and he said something back. Robb laughed, loud enough that it carried up to the battlements, and she knew the sound of Robb's laugh well enough to know this one was real. Jon clapped him once on the shoulder. Robb grabbed his arm and held it a moment longer than the gesture required. Then they separated, and Jon moved toward his horse, and Robb stood watching him go with the expression of a young man trying to look like he was not watching. Jon mounted. He did not look up at the battlements. He would not, she had not told him to, and he was too careful to look for things that might not be there. He settled into his saddle with the quiet competence of a boy who had been riding since he could hold a rein, pulled his hood against the wind, and waited. Ned gave the signal. The party moved. She watched them pass through the gate. Ned at the head. Jon slightly behind, slightly left. The position he had found for himself 14 years ago and never needed to be assigned. The gates closed. The sound of hooves diminished against the stone road, then the open ground, then the distance. She stayed at the battlements, not because she was waiting for something, because she was allowing herself, in private, on the cold stone above an empty yard. The one thing she did not allow in any room where she could be observed, the plain acknowledgement that what she had just sent south could not be recalled. The move was made. The piece was on the board. The wind came off the hills and found the gaps in her cloak, and she let it. Then she turned and went back inside and found the next letter waiting on the table. She sat down, picked up her pen, and began. The city smelled of other people. That was the first thing. Not the harbor, not the cook fires, not the specific rot of the bay at low tide. All of those were present and accounted for, layering themselves over each other in a way that the nose eventually stopped processing as distinct. It was the people themselves. 300,000 of them packed into a space that had been designed for a fraction of that number, and had simply absorbed the rest, building upward and inward and over itself, until the streets in Flea Bottom were more roof than sky. Jon had known King's Landing was large. He had known it the way he knew things from maps, correctly, accurately, and without the information that maps did not carry. The information maps did not carry, he understood now, was the weight of it. The specific pressure of that many lives moving against each other. The noise was not loud so much as constant, which was worse. It did not ebb. It had no quiet underneath it. He had woken at 2 bells his first night in the Tower of the Hand and lain with his eyes open, listening for the silence he could not find, and understood something about why Northerners and Southerners did not trust each other. They were not built from the same quiet. He filed this, and got up and went to work. The Red Keep's library was on the 3rd level of the eastern tower, accessed through a passage that smelled of old stone and lamp oil, and the particular dryness of rooms where parchment had been stored for longer than anyone currently living could remember. Ned had sent him for a volume on the administrative history of the small council, the kind of errand that was genuinely useful, and also gave Jon an hour of legitimate movement through the keep. He found the volume. He also found Tywin Lannister. The dwarf was in the corner that caught the best afternoon light, seated on a chest he had apparently dragged from the far wall to use as a step, reading something small and densely written with the total absorption of a man who had forgotten other people existed. He looked up when Jon entered, assessed the situation in approximately 1 second, and did not pretend to go back to his book. "Ned Stark's son," Tyrion said. "The other one, Jon Snow," Jon said. "I know who you are." Tyrion set his book face down across his knee, which told Jon the conversation had his real attention. Not polite attention, genuine attention, which was a different thing. You've been in the keep 3 days, and I've seen you in 4 different parts of it at 4 different times of day. You're either very diligent or very curious. Lord Stark needed several things, Jon said. Lord Stark has a household of 40 people. Several of them are paid specifically to retrieve things. Tyrion's mismatched eyes, one green, one black. We're doing the kind of looking that did not announce itself. You're not what I expected from Ned Stark's bastard. Jon kept his face level. What did you expect? Less looking at me as if you're considering a move 3 steps ahead. I'm just listening. Tyrion smiled. Not broadly. The smile of a man who was being told something he did not quite believe and found the telling interesting anyway. Of course you are. He reached for his book, then stopped, one hand on the spine. How old are you? 14. At 14 I had read everything in this library twice. I was also drunk most of the time, so the retention was imperfect. He opened the book. Then, without looking up, there's a restricted section behind the south wall. The door is behind the tapestry of the conquest. Maester Pycelle has the key. He also sleeps until the 9th bell, and leaves the key on his writing table. He turned a page. In case you were curious. Jon looked at him for a moment. Thank you, he said. I didn't say anything, Tyrion said, and went back to reading. Jaime Lannister was in the yard the following morning. He was training alone, which Jon gathered was unusual. The Kingsguard typically sparred in pairs, with purpose and schedule, but Jaime moved with the quality of a man for whom schedules were suggestions addressed to other people. His technique was extraordinary, and he knew it, which produced a particular kind of carelessness at the margins. Not sloppiness. The carelessness of someone who had been the best in every room for so long they had stopped checking. Jon was watching from the covered walkway above when Jaime looked up and saw him. You, Jaime said. The word was not unfriendly. Come down. This was a command disguised as an invitation. Jon came down. Jaime looked at him with the eyes of a man who assessed physical capability the way Catelyn assessed political situations, automatically, involuntarily, as a function of how he had organized his mind. He looked at Jon's shoulders, his stance, the way he held the practice sword that one of Ned's garrison men had left propped against the fence. How long? Jaime said. Since I was 6. Who taught you? Sir Roderick Castle. Some of the garrison men at Winterfell. Jaime picked up a practice sword and weighed it in one hand with the casual ease of a man for whom all swords were extensions of himself. Show me your guard. Jon raised the sword. Jaime corrected his elbow with the tip of his own blade, a single precise motion. Higher, you're protecting your shoulder at the cost of your throat. He stepped back. Come at me. Jon did not come at him. He waited. Jaime's expression shifted slightly. He had been expecting the lunge. Most boys lunged when given permission to attack Jaime Lannister, because most boys led with the part of themselves that wanted to say they had done it. Jon did not lunge, because Catelyn had spent 6 years teaching him that the thing everyone expected you to do was the most dangerous thing you could do. He waited, and watched, and let Jaime come to him. Jaime came. Jon parried. Lost the exchange in 4 moves. He was 14, and Jaime was 31, and the gap was not something preparation could fully close. But the loss had a shape to it that was not the shape of boys losing to men. He was not overwhelmed. He was outmaneuvered, which required a specific kind of thinking to accomplish. They went again. And again. Jon lost each time and each time differently, which meant he was not repeating mistakes, but encountering new ones, which was all learning ever was. After the 5th exchange, Jaime lowered his sword and looked at Jon with an expression that had changed in a way Jon could not fully name. You fight like someone who has something to lose, Jaime said. Jon met his eyes. Golden eyes. The eyes of the man who had put a sword through Aerys Targaryen's back in the throne room, an act that had ended one dynasty and built the foundation of everything that came after. Jon knew this. He held it somewhere below the surface, the way he held most things, and looked at Jaime across the practice swords and said, Don't you? Jaime stared at him. Then he laughed, a short, genuine sound, the kind that could not be produced on purpose, and turned and walked back toward the keep. He did not look back. But his stride for the length of the yard was slightly slower than it had been going out. Something had stayed with him. Jon filed this carefully, not as a victory, as a data point. 300 miles north, Catelyn Stark was meeting with the steward of a Tully bannerman, Lord Blackwood's man, a careful, middle-aged administrator who had ridden to Winterfell on what the official record described as a grain pricing dispute. She had arranged the official record herself. She told him what she needed. He told her what he could provide. She adjusted her requirements to match his capacity exactly, which she always did, because people who were not being asked for more than they had were people who did not feel the need to seek better terms elsewhere. She sent him south with a sealed letter for Lord Blackwood and a figure in her head that told her how much the Riverlands could supply. Quietly. Without a single lord being asked to commit to anything that could later be cited as mobilization. It was not mobilization yet, it was preparation. The difference was legal, and legal differences, in Catelyn's experience, were the kind that determined whether history recorded you as a traitor or a strategist. The child was in the corridor twice. The first time, Jon noticed and said nothing. A kitchen boy, young enough that he should have been running food, or cleaning hearths, or doing any of the dozen things kitchen children did in large households. Instead, he was in the passage outside the rooms Jon moved through, with no particular errand visible. He looked at Jon for a moment too long, and then looked away. The second time was in a different corridor, which made coincidence statistically implausible. That evening, Jon told Ned, not dramatically. He sat in the outer room of Ned's chambers and said, "While Ned was reviewing correspondence, we are being watched. Inside the keep, someone is moving children through the passages we use." Ned looked up. "One boy twice," Jon said. "Different corridors. No errand I could identify." He paused. "It may be the Master of Whisperers." Ned set down his letter. "What did you do?" Ned said. "Nothing," Jon said. "Changed nothing. Went where I was going." He met Ned's eyes. "If they see me change, they know I've seen them. If they don't see me change, they only know where I go." Ned looked at him for a moment with the particular expression that he had never fully learned to hide, the one where he was trying to separate the boy he remembered from the thing that was standing in front of him now. "Good," Ned said. Jon nodded and went to bed. What he did not tell Ned, because Ned did not need the weight of it and could not have changed it, was what he had felt in the corridor the second time, when the boy had looked at him and looked away. Not fear. Not anxiety. The very specific sensation of standing in a place where the walls were listening and the listeners did not yet know what they were hearing, which meant the listening could be shaped. Catelyn had told him, once, in the solar at Winterfell. With the fire burning low and her pen scratching across parchment, the most powerful position is not the one they watch. It is the one they watch and misunderstand. He pulled the blanket up in the dark and listened to King's Landing's unceasing noise and thought about what he was being seen as. A bastard squire. Ned Stark's quiet, serious, unremarkable second boy. Retrieving books and taking beatings in the yard from the Kingslayer and watching the walls with eyes that didn't miss much. Let them see that. He closed his eyes. Let them see exactly that. Robert Baratheon was dead by the time the maester finished speaking. Not surprising. Not, in the end, even particularly sudden. A man who drank that much and hunted that recklessly and had stopped. Somewhere around his 40th year, believing that consequences applied to him personally, was a man who had been writing his own ending in small increments for a long time. The bore had simply been the last increment. Jon had known this moment was approaching the way you knew weather was approaching on the open sea. Not the exact hour, but the direction and the size. He had been ready for 3 months. The small council convened that morning in a room that smelled of candle wax and suppressed panic. Cersei moved quickly, which Jon had expected. She was a woman who understood that windows were narrow, and hesitation was its own kind of surrender. By midday she was calling for Joffrey's immediate coronation, citing stability, citing mourning, citing the precedent of swift succession after a king's sudden death. The lords around the table were doing the thing that lords did in moments of genuine uncertainty, watching each other to determine what they thought. Ned sat in the hand's chair and said nothing. He let the current run. Jon was not in the room. He was in the passage outside it. In the specific posture of a squire waiting for instruction, holding a leather satchel across his knees with the careful neutrality of someone transporting documents. Which he was. 3 documents. The copy from the Citadel arrived 6 weeks ago through the Tully merchant channel, Howland Reed's written testimony, sealed and witnessed, which had arrived from Greywater Watch 40 days before Robert's death, as if someone had timed it. And a 3rd document, a legal brief, 3 pages, prepared by a maester whose political affiliations ran east toward the scholarly tradition rather than any particular house, outlining the succession argument in language stripped of sentiment. He listened to the muffled voices through the door. He had listened through many doors. The throne room was Ned's idea of where to do it, and Jon had not argued. Because Ned was correct in the way he was occasionally and inconveniently correct, the throne room was the only space in the Red Keep where the symbolic weight of what was about to happen could be borne by the architecture. A smaller room would have made it a conspiracy. The throne room made it a claim. They walked in together. Ned first, Jon a half step behind, to the left. The court was assembled because Cersei had called it assembled. She wanted witnesses to a coronation, and Ned had not objected, and his not objecting had read, to everyone watching, as acquiescence. The assumption that the hand would not disrupt the natural order had made 30 men come stand in this room when they might otherwise have been somewhere safer. Cersei was at the front, in the queen's position. Joffrey beside her, 12 years old, already holding his chin at the angle of a boy who had been told his entire life that he was owed the room. The small council on the steps. Sir Barristan in white armor by the throne itself. Jaime against the left wall watching. Oberyn Martell was in the gallery above. He had been in King's Landing for a month, officially to mourn a king, actually because the Red Viper of Dorne went where the blood was. Jon had sent him a message 4 days ago. 3 lines. The man responsible for ordering Elaya's murder is Tywin Lannister. The proof is available. Be at the throne room tomorrow. He had received no reply. But Oberyn was in the gallery. Ned stopped at the center of the room. The room oriented toward him the way rooms oriented toward men who had decided something, which produced its own gravity. Before the succession proceeds, Ned said, "I have information this court requires." Cersei's expression did not change. She had prepared for this, or some version of this. She was always prepared for some version of opposition. "Lord Stark," she said, with the temperature of something that had been cold long enough to forget warmth, "the king is 3 hours dead." "Whatever information you believe relevant, the king's heir," Ned said, "is not in this room." The chamber was very quiet. He laid the book on the table that had been arranged for the coronation documents, the lineages and histories of the great houses. He opened it to a marked page. He did not perform the presentation. He was Ned Stark, who had never been able to perform anything, and it turned out that was an advantage. A man without theater was a man who appeared to have nothing to hide. Every child Robert Baratheon fathered in 20 years carries the same inheritance, Ned said. Dark hair. Baratheon features. The blood breeds true. It always has. He looked at Joffrey, not with anger, with the specific sadness of a man naming a fact he had not wanted to be true. It has not bred true here. Jaime pushed off the wall. Not a movement toward combat, not yet. A movement of the body that had been in a held position, suddenly unable to hold it. Small, involuntary, Jon watched it and noted it, because Jaime's golden face, cracking at the margins, was the confirmation the room needed before any document was presented. "This is slander," Cersei said, clear and flat and controlled in the way she controlled things when the control was costing her something. The word of a northern lord against the queen. Jon Arryn made the same discovery before his death, Ned said. He is buried in the Eyrie. The question of why he died, and who benefited, is one this court will also need to address. He looked up. But first, there is a more immediate matter of succession. He looked at Jon. Jon stood. He had thought, in the weeks of preparation, that this moment would feel like something large and separate from ordinary experience. He had been wrong. It felt like the next thing after the previous thing. Like waking up. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. 14 years of being called Your Grace in a cold solar, by a woman who never raised her voice, had produced something in him that he was only now, standing in the Iron Throne room with 300 pairs of eyes on his face, beginning to understand. He reached into the satchel, set the documents on the table beside the lineages book. "My name is Jon Snow," he said. He used the same voice he used for everything, measured, without emphasis, the voice of someone reporting rather than arguing. "I was born at the Tower of Joy, in Dorne, in 283 AC. My mother was Lyanna Stark, who died in labor 3 days after the fall of King's Landing." He put one hand flat on the copy from the Citadel. "My father was Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. Their marriage was performed in secret by High Septon Maynard. The record of that ceremony is here, copied from the Citadel archive at Old Town, witnessed and attested. The written testimony of Howland Reed, Lord of Greywater Watch, who was present at the Tower of Joy and witnessed my mother's final hours, is here." He looked at the court. He did not look for the reactions he wanted. He looked at the room the way he had learned to look at rooms, everything, processed. "I am the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. I am legitimate by the record of their marriage. I ask this court to acknowledge my claim." Silence. The specific silence of a room trying to determine what it had just been told. Cersei found her voice first. She found it loudly and at a register that had abandoned its previous cold control. "Kill him," she said. "To the Kingsguard, to anyone listening. This is treason. This is fabrication. Kill him." Sir Barristan did not move. Neither did the 2 Stark household guards who had positioned themselves inside the throne room's side entrance 20 minutes before the court assembled. From the gallery, Oberyn Martell rose. He did not shout. He did not need to. The Red Viper of Dorne had a quality of attention, not presence, exactly, but the quality that presence was a pale description of, that produced silence around him the way a stone produced ripples. He leaned on the gallery railing and looked down at Cersei Lannister with 15 years of patience and its own specific violence underneath. "I came to this city for justice," Oberyn said. "I have been told, politely and repeatedly, that justice was not available. I find that the timing of its unavailability has been very consistent." He looked at Jon. Then at the documents on the table. Then back at Cersei. "I will add my voice to the testimony regarding Tywin Lannister's orders at the sack of King's Landing. I will name Gregor Clegane. I will name Amory Lorch. And I will name the man who sent them." His eyes returned to Cersei. "Your father is not in this city today." "I have been wondering about the timing of that as well." The Lannister guards moved. 8 men, in gold and crimson, hands on swords, looking at Sir Barristan and at each other and at the 2 Stark guards by the entrance, and calculating the kind of calculation that men with swords made when they were about to be asked to do something that depended entirely on which way the room fell. "Do not," Barristan said. One word. From the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, in his white armor with his white sword at his hip and the weight of 40 years of service behind it. Not a threat. A fact. The Lannister guards did not draw. Joffrey turned to his mother with the beginning of something that was going to become crying if it was not managed, and Cersei put one hand on his shoulder without looking at him. Still looking at Jon, with the green eyes calculating distances and options and the speed with which everything she had built was coming apart at its foundations. "This proves nothing," she said. "A document. A dead septon. The word of a crannogman who lives in a swamp." She was still controlled. A lesser woman would have lost the control 3 minutes ago. Robert Baratheon conquered the 7 kingdoms. That conquest does not end because a boy with a piece of parchment walks into the throne room. Robert Baratheon's own grandmother was a Targaryen princess, Jon said. His claim to the throne was built partly on that blood. The argument that Targaryen lineage confers legitimacy was made at the beginning of his reign and accepted by this court. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. I am not asking the court to accept a new principle. I am asking it to apply the existing one. The room was still. Ned had been standing at the table throughout. He looked now at the Iron Throne, the swords of 1,000 defeated kings fused into something that had never been comfortable, and had never been designed to be, and then at his son, who was standing in the center of the King's Landing court at 15 years old, making a legal argument with the composure of a man who had been practicing it his entire life without knowing when he would need to deliver it. Something shifted in Ned Stark's chest. Not pride, precisely. Not relief, precisely. The specific quality of a weight that had been distributed. Finally, across enough points of support that no single point was in danger of collapse, he had carried this alone first. Then with Catelyn. Then with Jon. And now it was in the room. And the room had heard it, and the room could not unhear it. Lyanna's face, somewhere below him in the crypts of Winterfell, carved in stone, holding roses. She had made him promise. She had not asked him whether the promise was possible to keep, because she was dying and did not have time for that conversation, and because she had looked at him with those gray eyes and known the answer. He had kept it. He looked at her son, standing in the room the kingdom would have denied him. He let himself feel it. Once. Fully. Before he put it away. The relief of a man who has carried something very heavy for a very long time, and has set it down in the right place. Then he turned to address the court, and the work continued. Stannis Baratheon's raven arrived at dawn. Not to Jon. To Ned as hand, which told Catelyn everything she needed to know about how Stannis had decided to frame this as a legal matter between offices rather than a confrontation between men, because Stannis was incapable of doing anything except through the correct channel, even when the correct channel was a formality inside a crisis. She read the letter standing at the window of Riverrune's Solar, where she had been since her father's breathing changed in the night. The letter was 12 sentences. Every sentence was a legal argument. Not a single sentence was incorrect by the rules Stannis followed, which was exactly the problem. Robert's conquest established the Baratheon dynasty. The Iron Throne passes to the nearest legitimate male heir of the last king. Targaryen dynastic claims were extinguished by that conquest. Any contrary argument requires the premise that military defeat does not transfer sovereign right, which premise, applied consistently, would destabilize every throne in the history of Westeros. I am the rightful king. I require the crown, or I require war. 12 sentences. She read them a second time, then set the letter on the windowsill and went to her father's room. Hoster Tully was dying the way he had done most things in his life, slowly, methodically, in his own time, in his own bed, with the specific dignity of a man who had decided how this was going to go and was implementing the decision. He had been dying for the better part of a year. He had refused, with the stubbornness that Catelyn recognized as family trait rather than personal quirk, to do it faster. She sat beside him. The room smelled of the medicines Maester Vyman kept prescribing, and Hoster kept taking with the resigned compliance of a man who understood they would not help, and took them anyway. Because the Maester needed to feel useful and there was no cost to the courtesy. He said no, Hoster said. He had not opened his eyes. He said it in 12 sentences, Catelyn said. Something that was almost a smile. Stannis, his voice was the rough, careful voice of a man rationing breath. I met him once. At a tournament before the rebellion. He watched every bout without moving. Didn't cheer, didn't wince, just watched, like he was taking inventory. A pause. Inflexible men are either the most dangerous problem or the most useful tool. Depends entirely on whether they're pointed the right direction. He's pointed at Jon. For now. Hoster's hand moved on the blanket. Catelyn put hers over it. He did not acknowledge the gesture, and she did not expect him to. They were not, between them, a family that acknowledged gestures. They made them. The Tyrell girl. I'm meeting with the grandmother tomorrow. Olenna, his eyes opened, pale now, where they had been vivid. Don't let her set the terms. She'll try. She sets terms the way other women breathe. He looked at Catelyn with the eyes that had always seen further through her than she entirely liked. Don't show her the whole board. I never show anyone the whole board. You showed me. You were dying. It seemed unkind to make you wait. He made a sound that was the relative of a laugh. Olenna Redwine, Lady Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, grandmother to Margaery and Loras, and the entire flowering apparatus of Highgarden's ambition. Arrived at River Run the following morning in a wheelhouse that was better appointed than most rooms Catelyn had slept in. She emerged from it at her own pace, leaning on a cane she clearly did not need for balance, and used instead as a kind of portable authority, and looked at River Run's courtyard with the expression of a woman who had seen better. She was shown to Catelyn's solar. She sat without being offered the seat. She looked at the wine Catelyn had arranged and said, "Dornish red." "Acceptable," and poured herself a cup before the servant could. Catelyn sat. Waited. "You're not what I expected," Lyanna said. "What did you expect?" A northern woman. She said it the way people said things that were meant to encompass several complaints simultaneously. Hard eyes. No furniture sense. Wool in summer. She looked at Catelyn with the sharp, unhurried assessment of someone who had been reading people for 70 years and had stopped being surprised by most of them. Instead, I find Hoster Tully's daughter running a network that reaches from the Wall to Old Town, and somehow managed to keep a Targaryen heir breathing for 15 years inside the castle of a man who would have killed him. A pause. Impressive. Thank you. It wasn't a compliment. It was an inventory. Lyanna drank. The boy. What about him? I want to see him. He's in King's Landing. Then bring him here. Not yet, Catelyn said. Olenna's eyes sharpened slightly. She was not accustomed to not yet. Lady Stark, I am not withholding him from you as a negotiating tactic, Catelyn said. I am telling you he is not available because the timing of his movement matters more than your schedule. When it is correct for him to be seen, you will see him. She held the old woman's gaze. You did not ride to River Run because you needed to inspect the merchandise. You rode because you need to know if the woman managing this is worth committing the reach to. Lyanna considered her for a long moment. Then she set down her cup. He's very young, Lyanna said. He has been prepared for this since he was 6 years old, Catelyn said. Every map, every political structure, every faith tradition, every military reality of this realm has been part of his education for 15 years. There is no king in the history of Westeros who entered a throne room better prepared for what waited inside it. She held Olenna's gaze without blinking. Youth is a variable. Preparation is not. Lyanna looked at her steadily, the old eyes doing their inventory. Then, after a pause that carried its own weight, you believe that. I have spent 15 years making it true. What is it you want from the Reach? Grain? Men? The Tyrell name on a document? A queen, Catelyn said. When the time is correct, and not before, and not as a transaction, as an alliance between houses that understand what they are building. She looked at Lyanna without blinking. Margaery Tyrell becomes queen of a stable realm with a capable king who will reign for 40 years. That is not a favor we are asking. That is the most advantageous match in the history of your house. Lyanna was quiet for long enough that the fire between them did the only talking. Send me the boy, she said finally. I want to see his hands. You can always tell a man's future by his hands, when the time is correct. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. Lyanna picked up her cup. Something in her face had shifted by a degree that would have been invisible to anyone who had not been watching for it. The Reach will not commit formally until I've seen him. She set the cup down. But we will not commit to anyone else in the interim. Is that sufficient? It was more than sufficient. It was, in the architecture Catelyn had been building for 15 years, the final load-bearing piece sliding into position. Yes, she said. Jon's response to Stannis took 3 days to write, not because he did not know what to say. He had known the broad shape of it from the moment Ned showed him the letter, but because the words required precision in every direction simultaneously, and imprecision with Stannis Baratheon was its own kind of aggression. Stannis was a man who read text the way other men read terrain, for weakness, for inconsistency, for the gap between what was said and what was meant. He deserved a response that had none. He sent it through the official Raven chain. He did not dress it in strategy. He did not flatter. Your legal argument is not wrong by the rules you follow. Those rules exist because succession by clear law prevents the chaos of contested succession. I share that value. I differ on which law applies, the rule of Baratheon succession. Established 15 years ago by conquest, or the rule of hereditary right, which predates the conquest by 3 centuries, and which Robert's own claim required to be valid. I am not asking you to be wrong. I am asking you to determine which framework, consistently applied, serves the realm. I offer you this, Lord of Dragonstone. Master of ships, supreme command of the Westerosi fleet and authority over naval defense of the realm. No diminishment of your legal honor. Recognition, in writing, witnessed by a Grand Maester and a High Septon, that your claim was legally coherent by one reasonable interpretation of succession law. What I cannot offer is the crown. I believe you understand why, and I believe you are a man who values accuracy over flattery, so I will not pretend the reason is other than it is. The crown is mine by the older right, and we both know it. He sent it. He waited. 3 days of silence from Dragonstone. Then, 4. On the 5th day the reply arrived. 7 sentences. Stannis had added one to his usual count, which Jon decided was, for Stannis, the equivalent of an emotional response. The arrangement must be in writing. Witnessed by a Grand Maester and a High Septon, as stated. No provision for unilateral revision by either party without a council of 7 lords. The title, Lord of Dragonstone, to pass to my heirs. My fleet remains under my command, with operational coordination to the Crown in matters of joint defense. These terms are non-negotiable. If they are met, I will present my fleet at King's Landing within a fortnight. Jon read it once and handed it to Ned. Ned read it and looked up. He's accepting. Yes, Jon said, in the most Stannis possible way. Yes, Jon said, and something that was almost a smile crossed his face and was gone. The letter arrived at River Run on a Tuesday. Catelyn read it at her father's bedside, where she had spent most of the last 3 days, because Hoster's breathing had developed an irregularity that Maester Vyman described with careful medical language that meant soon. She read the letter aloud to him. Not all of it. The essential part. The fleet at King's Landing within a fortnight. Stannis neutralized without blood. Hoster was quiet for a moment. His eyes were closed. Did we win? He said. Not yet, she said. The ghost of something. Not quite satisfaction. The expression of a man who has placed a very long bet and heard news of the early results. But we're going to. Not a question. Catelyn took his hand. She had done it twice in her life. This was the second time. He did not acknowledge it. She did not expect him to. Yes, she said. Hoster Tully, Lord of River Run, died 3 days later. The river below the walls was running high with autumn rain, and the banner of the leaping trout came down at dawn, and Catelyn stood at the window and looked at the water for a long time. She did not cry. She had cried for him years ago, in smaller increments, as he diminished. What she felt now was the specific weight of an inheritance, not the castle, not the title, not the Tully lands and obligations that would pass to Edmure. The other inheritance, the one he had accepted from her hands 14 years ago when she had written him coded letters about a ward, and he had read them correctly and never once asked her to explain herself more plainly. He had trusted her. All the way to the end. She turned from the window, found her pen. The Reach needed confirmation. The River Lords needed instruction. Edmure needed direction he did not yet know he needed. She sat down and began. Casterly Rock was not a castle. That was the first thing Jon understood when he saw it, and understanding it correctly was the difference between a campaign that worked and one that spent itself against stone until there was nothing left to spend. Every account he had read described it as a castle, the seat of House Lannister, impregnable fortress, greatest stronghold in the 7 kingdoms. The accounts were wrong in the way that maps were wrong, accurate in outline, useless in texture. Casterly Rock was a mountain that had been persuaded, over 1,000 years of incremental ambition, to become a building. It rose from the western coast like something the land had grown, rather than something men had made. Golden stone catching the morning light in a way that was either beautiful or obscene, depending on what you knew about the family inside it. Jon looked at it for a long time from the ridge above Lannisport. Robb stood beside him, arms crossed, doing his own looking. "I see why nobody's taken it," Robb said. "Nobody's tried to make it irrelevant," Jon said. Robb turned. "Explain. A siege requires the besieged to care about being besieged. Tywin cares because the rock is his identity. It is the physical expression of Lannister permanence. Take that away, and you have a man defending a symbol, not a position." Jon looked at the harbor below, where Lannisport's docks extended into the sunset sea. Where the Lannister merchant fleet sat at anchor and trade, moved in and out with the rhythm of a house that had been wealthiest in the realm for so long, it had stopped noticing wealth as distinct from air. The harbor first. Then the inland passes. Then we wait. And if he breaks out, then we find out if 15 years of preparation is enough for what comes through that door. Robb looked at the rock again. Then at Jon. He had the expression he wore when he was running the military logic, and finding it sound, but feeling something additional that the logic did not fully account for. "You're not afraid of him," Robb said. "Not an accusation. Genuine curiosity." "I'm afraid of wasting what we have," Jon said. "Tywin inside that rock is a problem with a solution. Tywin in the field with nothing to lose is a different kind of problem. He turned from the ridge, so we keep him inside until inside stops working." The harbor was sealed in 2 days. Stannis' fleet, which had arrived at King's Landing within the fortnight as promised, because Stannis Baratheon did what he said he would do, with the mechanical consistency of a man for whom integrity was not virtue but simply accuracy, moved up the western coast under the command of Sir Davos Seaworth, a smuggler turned admiral who understood coastlines the way other men understood people. The Lannisport docks went quiet. The merchant ships stopped moving. The garrison inside the rock watched their sea access close from the walls and did the arithmetic that men in supply-dependent fortresses always eventually did. The inland passes were Robb's. He took the northern approaches with 3,000 northern horse and the particular aggressive patience he had developed over a year of campaign, not reckless, not tentative, the midpoint that only a natural commander found without being told to look for it. He positioned his men not at the passes themselves, but at the supply points feeding them, the wayhouses, the small keeps. The market villages where the Westerland's interior sent food toward the coast. He did not burn. Jon had been specific about that. A lord who burns the small folks' livelihoods inherits their hatred, and Jon had decided he was not inheriting hatred if he could avoid it. Robb had not argued. Robb rarely argued with the strategy. He argued with the details, which was useful, and implemented the strategy with a creative violence that Jon trusted completely. The Tyrell army closed the southern approaches by the 3rd week. Lord Mace Tyrell was not a gifted commander. He was a man who understood that being in the right place at the right time was 90% of generalship, and had enough competent subordinates that the remaining 10% was managed for him. The Reach's army was enormous and fed itself on Reach grain, which meant the siege lines did not require resupply from Jon's own stretched logistics. Jon wore gray and black, Catelyn's suggestion which he had received in a letter 3 weeks before the campaign began. In her characteristic style, stated once, not explained, accompanied by the clear implication that the explanation was available to anyone who thought for 30 seconds. Stark gray for his mother's people. Targaryen black for his father's dynasty. Not a crown, he wore no crown in the field. The crown came after. In battle he was a commander, and commanders wore armor. And the armor's colors told the story that words would have taken longer to tell. The Westerland's lords were watching. Not all of them had committed to Tywin. Several had sent riders to Jon's camp, tentative, careful, men who understood which way the wind was moving and wanted to be on record as having noticed early. Jon received them himself, listened carefully, made no promises he could not keep and kept every promise he made, which produced after 3 weeks a working relationship with 4 minor Westerland's lords that Tywin would not have predicted and could not have planned against. The Rock's garrison began eating its reserve stores in the 5th week. Tywin came out on the morning of the 42nd day, not because the food was gone, it wasn't, not yet. Because Tywin Lannister had spent 50 years understanding leverage, and he understood precisely that a man who waited until he was genuinely starving had waited too long. He was not a man who waited too long. Jon was in the command position on the southern ridge when the rock's great gates opened. He felt it before he heard it, the specific quality of his outrider's signal, which carried a different urgency from the routine reports. He stood from the camp chair where he had been reviewing maps and looked east. 2,000 heavy cavalry. Lannister crimson, morning sun catching the armor in a way that was deliberately spectacular. Tywin would have thought about what it looked like. Would have chosen the morning for the light, because even a breakout was a performance when Tywin conducted it. He had identified the thinnest point of Jon's encirclement and aimed at it, the junction between the northern horse and the Reach's western flank, a natural seam in coordinated forces that experienced eyes could find. Tywin was at the front. At 58, in full plate, on a warhorse that was massive enough to suggest the logistics of the choice had been considered. Jon watched him come. He's going to reach the junction. The thought was cold and analytical, not panicked. He's fast enough and heavy enough. He planned this for a week. He's been watching the patrol timing. "Robb," Jon said to the rider already beside him. "I see it," Robb said. He had seen it 30 seconds ago. "North or south of the junction?" "North. I'll take south." "Go." Robb was already moving. He rode the way he did everything, without consultation once the decision was made, with a commitment that converted immediately into speed. His horse hit full stride in 4 lengths, and the northern cavalry behind him organized itself around him, the way water organized itself around a stone dropped into it, naturally, without instruction. The two forces converged on the junction from both sides before Tywin's cavalry reached it. What followed was not a battle so much as a collision of mathematics. Tywin was outnumbered and now flanked, and the junction he had aimed at was sealed before he arrived, and the momentum that had made his breakout possible for 40 seconds was now the thing working against him. 2,000 heavy cavalry at full charge could not stop and reverse cleanly, and stopping and reversing cleanly was what the situation required. His cavalry hit the combined northern reach flank and drove partway through it. Men died. Jon felt the press of it from the south, the specific physical reality of combat that no map preparation fully accounted for, the noise, the confusion of horses in close quarters, the way individual decisions happened faster than thought. He fought in the space between the analytical and the instinctive, which was where he had spent years learning to operate. It took 30 minutes. At the end of 30 minutes, Tywin Lannister's cavalry was surrounded, and Tywin himself was unhorsed, not from being beaten, from his horse going down under him, which was luck rather than skill. And Tywin's face, when he rose from the mud, showed that he understood the distinction. He was ringed by Stark men before he reached his feet. Jon dismounted 20 feet away, walked toward him. Tywin was still imposing. In the mud, in damaged armor, 60 yards from a battle that had just ended against him, he was still the specific kind of imposing that came from a lifetime of being the most powerful man in every room. He looked at Jon with eyes that were making calculations even now, even here, because that was simply what Tywin Lannister's eyes did. Jon stopped, 5 feet away. The field around them was going quiet, the way fields went quiet after the noise stopped, men and horses settling, the particular aftermath of controlled violence. Tywin looked at him for a long moment. "You are not what I expected," he said. "You are exactly what I expected," Jon said. Something moved through Tywin's face, not insult. Something closer to the involuntary recognition of a man hearing an accurate statement. He looked at Jon's armor, the gray and black, the Stark wolf in the space where a Targaryen dragon would eventually appear, and then at Jon's face, which was 14 years of Catelyn's curriculum looking back at him without blinking. "What will you do with me?" Tywin said. "I'm not sure yet," Jon said. "What would you do?" "Execute me." "I know." A pause. The wind moved across the field. Somewhere in the Lannisport direction, a horse was being calmed by a handler, the sound distant and ordinary against the extraordinary of everything else. "You'll serve better alive. The realm needs to know that the man who ordered Elya's murder faced justice. Prison serves that purpose as well as a scaffold. Better, in some ways." He held Tywin's gaze. A dead man stops reminding people. A living one, in a cell, is a permanent demonstration. Tywin studied him with the eyes of a man who had spent 50 years assessing people and rarely found them surprising. "Your mother would have made the same calculation," he said. Jon looked at him steadily. "Which one?" he said. Tywin had no answer. The silence stretched between them on the churned field below Casterly Rock, in the mud and the morning light, and the rock's golden walls rose behind the old man in the damaged armor, and meant, for the first time in its history, nothing that could protect him. Jon turned to the Stark captain at his shoulder. "See to his comfort," he said. "He is a prisoner of the crown. He is to be treated accordingly." He walked back toward his horse. Behind him, the greatest threat his claim had faced was being escorted toward captivity by men wearing gray. The rock's gates were still open. Jon looked at them once. Then he mounted, and rode to find Robb, and behind him the Westerland's wind moved across a field that had just changed the shape of everything. The crown was not the old one. The old Targaryen crown was gone, lost in the decades of the rebellion, melted or hidden or simply mislaid in the chaos of a dynasty's collapse, as if even the objects of that reign had understood they were not permanent. The royal smiths had spent 3 weeks on the replacement, working from a design that Jon had given them in a single sentence, something that is both things at once. They had understood, or they had tried to, which was usually sufficient. The result sat on a velvet cushion in the Red Keep's antechamber, while Jon looked at it and tried to feel what he had been told he would feel. Black iron, hand-forged rather than cast, its surface worked in the northern style, angular, without the decorative excess of southern metalwork, built to suggest permanence rather than beauty. Set into the center, a wolf's head carved from pale weirwood, the same white pale wood as the trees in every godswood in the north, the same wood the old gods had looked through for 8,000 years. Around the wolf, iron dragons in low relief, barely visible unless the light caught them at the right angle. You had to look for the dragons. They were there. They did not announce themselves. He thought Catelyn would approve of that. The great sept of Baelor held 3,000 people when pressed, and it was pressed. Jon walked the central aisle between them for the anointing ceremony. The religious component of what the day required, the part belonging to the faith and its 7 oils, and the High Septon's words before the eyes of the gods the South worshipped. He wore black and gray, no crown. The crown was not a sept matter. It never had been. The High Septon was new. The old one had fled with the Lannister faction 8 months ago, which Jon had expected and planned for. And the replacement had been selected with Ned's input and Catelyn's written recommendations, and the particular care of people who understood that the man doing this ceremony was as important as the ceremony itself. He was 60, Old Town trained, with the steady hands and neutral political history of someone who had spent his career caring more about theology than power. The 7 oils were cold. He had not expected that. He had expected ceremony to transcend physical sensation, to exist in some elevated register where the temperature of oil on the forehead was irrelevant. Instead it was simply cold, and the High Septon's hands were dry and careful, and the words of the anointing were the same words that had been said over kings for 300 years. And they were just words until they weren't. Aegon of houses Targaryen and Stark. 6th of his name. May the Father grant him justice, the warrior grant him strength, the smith grant him the wisdom to build, and not only to break. The anointing ended. Jon rose. 3,000 people watched him walk back down the aisle without a crown on his head, which was correct, which was how it had always been done in this sept and every sept before it, the faith anointed, the throne crowned, and the difference between those 2 acts was the difference between sacred and sovereign. Both were required, neither substituted for the other. The Red Keep's throne room was less crowded and more dangerous, which was also how it had always been. The lords and ladies who filled the gallery and the floor had been here before for a different succession, had stood in these same positions waiting for Joffrey's coronation to begin, and instead had watched everything they thought they knew become something else. The room had a memory of that day. Jon could feel it in the way people arranged themselves, slightly more careful, slightly more watchful, the posture of people who understood that throne rooms contained surprises. The Iron Throne was at the far end. He had stood before it once, with Catelyn after the Lannister trial. He had formed his opinion of it that night and not revised it since. He walked toward it now with the court assembled on both sides, and he found the faces he needed in the specific order he needed them. Robb was at his right hand, which was where Robb had always been, in practice yards and camps and the long year of campaign that had brought them both to this room. He was wearing the grey of Winterfell and the expression of a young man who was proud and trying to look like he was simply present. He was not succeeding. Jon was glad he was not succeeding. Stannis stood in his correct position, master of ships, lord of Dragonstone, the only man in the room whose attendance represented a genuine concession rather than enthusiasm. He was rigid, straight-backed, wearing his house colors with the precision of a man who had read the protocol document 3 times to ensure compliance. He was looking at the Iron Throne rather than at Jon, which Jon decided was, for Stannis, something close to warmth. Oberyn Martell sat in the Dornish contingent, with the specific quality of a man who had arrived at a destination he had been traveling toward for 15 years, and was still deciding what to feel about the arrival. Tywin Lannister was in a cell in the Red Keep, where Oberyn had seen him twice, formal, witnessed, brutal in the documentary way that Oberyn had eventually accepted, was more durable than the other kind of brutal. Gregor Clegane was dead. A trial in absentia and a long illness had concluded that particular accounting. It was not everything. Oberyn's face showed clearly that it was not everything. But it was something that could be held and examined and returned to, and for a man who had spent 15 years holding only grief, something was different from nothing. Sansa was in the gallery with Arya beside her. Sansa watched the ceremony with the eyes of a girl of 13 who had spent her childhood imagining great halls and discovered, at that age, that real great halls were more complicated than the imagined ones, and more meaningful for that. Arya was watching the Kingsguard, cataloging their sword positions, which Jon had known she would do, and had found, privately, correct. Jon stopped before the Iron Throne. The High Septon had traveled from the Sept for this second portion. He stood at the foot of the throne steps with the crown on its cushion and the words of the crowning ready, the sovereign words, the ones the faith administered at the seat of power rather than in a house of worship, completing what the anointing had begun. The crown settled on his head, heavier than he had expected. He had held it in the antechamber and thought he knew the weight of it. And he had been wrong in the way that knowing something abstractly and knowing it with your body were different kinds of knowledge. The iron was cold against his temples. The weirwood wolf's head sat at his brow in the carved likeness of every Stark who had come before him. He sat in the Iron Throne. Not comfortably. The thing had never been designed for comfort. The sword edges at its arms and back were a reminder, deliberate and constant, that what this seat represented had been paid for in other men's blood. He sat in it anyway, because that was what the moment required, and let the court see him sitting in it, and let that image do the work that words would have taken longer to do. 3,000 people, and the silence between them. Then the room found its voice, and the voice was the kind that moved through stone. Ned refused the handship afterward, in the small room off the throne room's eastern passage, with the sounds of the court's reception audible through the walls. He had told Jon he would refuse. Jon had arranged the formal offer anyway because some things required the form regardless of the outcome. And Ned deserved the form. "I won't be good at it," Ned said. He said it the way he said true things, without preamble, without apology. "I know," Jon said. "That's not why I offered it." Ned looked at him. "Why then?" "Because you deserved to be asked. After everything." Jon paused. "And because I needed you to know I asked." Ned was quiet for a moment. He looked older than he had when they arrived in King's Landing 2 years ago. Not diminished, older in the way that men who had carried something heavy for a long time looked when the weight was finally distributed elsewhere. Lighter, but shaped by the carrying. "When I need the North," Jon said, "the North answers." "The North always answers," Ned said. "It's what we do." He put one hand briefly on Jon's shoulder, the gesture he had always used, brief, without ceremony, the one Jon had been measuring his entire life against the more elaborate affections other fathers showed their sons, and finding it sufficient. More than sufficient. "Go," Ned said. "They're waiting for you." Jon went. She was alone in the throne room. He did not look for her there. He had come from the reception, moving through the keep with the reduced household that now accompanied a king rather than a squire, and had stopped at the throne room doors because he could see, through the gap, a single figure standing before the Iron Throne in the torchlight. He told the guards to stay, went in alone. The throne room was quieter than it had been an hour ago. The court's voices still reached it faintly from the connected halls, muffled by stone, the sound of 300 people celebrating something that had taken 15 years to arrive at. Catelyn stood before the Iron Throne with her hands at her sides and her back very straight, which was how she stood when she was processing something she had not yet finished processing. He crossed the room and stood beside her. They looked at the throne together for a moment. Neither of them spoke. The torches moved. "It's uglier than I imagined," Jon said. "Most things worth having are," she said. Another silence. The crown's weight was still present at his temples. He had kept it on, which was correct, which was what kings did in the hours following their crowning. "You called me your grace," Jon said, "for 14 years, in a cold room at night when no one else was there." "I did. I never thanked you." She was quiet for a moment. The throne's iron caught the torchlight and held none of it. "You shouldn't thank me for what I did," she said. "I did it for my family." "I know," Jon said. A pause. "That's why I'm thanking you." She looked at the throne for another long moment. He looked at her, this woman who had taken a secret she had not chosen and built 15 years of careful, exhausting, specific work around it, who had called him your grace in the dark when no one was watching, who had never embraced him or called him son, and had given him everything those words contained anyway, in the form of maps and political lessons, and the cold competence of someone who had decided his survival was the most important project of her life. She turned and gave him the smallest nod she had. The same one. The one from a throne room 14 years ago, when Robert Baratheon had looked at him too long and he had held his composure, and she had looked across the hall and said, with that single motion, "Well done." Then she turned and walked back toward the doors, toward Ned, toward home. She did not look back at the throne. She did not need to. It was, at last, secure. The reception lasted until the second bell past midnight. Lords from 6 of the 7 kingdoms drank Arbor Gold and told each other stories about what they had done to make this moment possible, and some of those stories were true, and all of them were less true than the one they did not know, the one that had begun at Riverrun 17 years ago with a woman holding a baby in a garden in the rain, making a decision that no one had asked her to make and that she had made anyway, completely, without leaving herself a way back. Jon stood at the window of the Hand's Tower, his tower now, until he moved to the royal chambers, and looked out at King's Landing. 300,000 people, and all their lights, and all their noise. And below it the harbor, where Stannis' fleet sat at anchor, like a promise being kept. He was 16 years old. He had a crown he had not wanted, and a throne that was uglier than imagination, and a kingdom that would require the rest of his life to manage correctly. He had a brother in Winterfell, and a mother in a crypt in the north, and a father dead on the Trident. And the living woman who had raised him was already packing, somewhere in the keep, to go home. He stayed at the window until the city's lights began to thin. Then he straightened, turned from the glass, and went to the desk where the first of the morning's correspondence was already waiting. He sat down, picked up the pen. There was a great deal of work left. He began. "Let us know what you'd like to see next." The end.